Well, hi, welcome back, Corey. That was
Thanks
such a
for having me.
marvelous film. It's one of my favorite films in the festival.
Thank
And
you so much.
I'm just very intrigued in how did this all get started? It's such an
Yeah,
amazing journey, and I know that there's a lot of pieces to it.
thank you. Yeah, there were a lot of pieces, certainly. And the film came about in a very organic way, and then grew, I think, in maybe a bit of an unconventional way. So the whole film began, I went to Cuba and I met our main subjects, Frank and Yaya. Um, I met them under no pretenses of wanting to make a film. Um, but they started telling me a bit about the surfing community there and about some of the things that they struggled with. And they were also really proud, I think, of a lot of the ways that they've sort of grown their surf community without having a lot of resources. That was something that they were always sort of uh, wanting to showcase. And I think that there's also this sort of divide between Cuba and the outside world that we try and show as much as we can in the film. And so whenever an outsider comes in, there's this willingness to share what their whole community is about. And so the first trip where I met them, they kind of just sparked this interest, and my partners and I eventually went down to Cuba with the intention of filming this short film. And the more we got to know them and the more we sort of experienced what they were experiencing, the more the film grew and grew until it was eventually a feature film.
Yeah, and I guess like originally it was supposed to be like just a 3-month project.
Yeah. Yeah, that was our first goal. And I think it was one of those things where it's sort of all of the things that seem like problems were sort of divine interventions in some regard. The initial film was really going to be about how they make surfboards from refrigerator foam, and it was sort of like in some ways, the like stereotypical Cuban story, which is, make do with what you have, uh, and figure it out with what's at your fingertips.
Yeah.
And as we were making that story, we show up and Frank's partner is pregnant, and we're like, oh, this is totally throwing a wrench in the spokes of this. Like, he's not going to be able to go and do everything that we were hoping to do as far as surfing. And yeah, we saw it at first as like this obstacle, and then we started to realize that there was really a much richer human story. It wasn't just about this one focus that we were looking at. It was really about Frank and Yaya and Yenya and all these characters, and much more about them than it was just about the thing. And so that, I think, really grew the scope of the story and sort of the arc that we ended up telling.
And not only that, but the world was changing quite a bit too. They had Rolling Stones came to Cuba.
Yeah,
Obama came to Cuba. Things
yeah,
changing mightily.
yeah. It was really hard for us, putting the story together and trying to decide what things were most important to share, because so much stuff was changing around them. And we were there for all those moments. We were there for the Rolling Stones concert. We were there for Obama's visit, and we filmed the motorcade rolling through town. And we had all these kind of big political moments. And then we went back down after Trump was elected, and he shut everything back down and kind of reversed the whole story. But as we've gone through a ton of different iterations making the film. And every time we put those pieces in, it didn't really feel very authentic
Or intimate. Yeah.
or intimate. Yeah, it felt like those big things, and those are topics that just suck so much energy. That we found that they sort of distracted from the characters, which is, as you're making it, you're kind of diving more and more into them, and those elements also they're big for the world, but for our characters, they also were not really that blown away by that stuff. For them, it was sort of like another false start. They're looking at all these events and going, yeah, well, we've been promised change before, and we don't really look at this stuff as though it's going to completely change our worlds yet. So when we tried to jam those into the film, it was kind of like, well, is this for us or is this for them? Is it good for the story? And ultimately we were like, no, this is a thing that we know is important in the world, but for our story, it just didn't really fit. And so all those things, yeah, got left on the cutting room floor.
Well, that was one of the things I really appreciated about the film, is that it didn't dwell on those external issues going on, but they were there. They were still there in the background. You knew that things were changing for the characters in the film, the subjects.
Yeah. No, and I think we tried to include them in a way that felt more like how they experienced it. Like it is a little bit auxiliary. It isn't so front and center the way it's kind of the way it's present in media, you know. Mm-hmm. For them, it was just another thing kind of bubbling in the background.
Now, why was it illegal to surf in Cuba?
So the whole history is very complicated, and they also have a complicated way of existing in Cuba, where it's very much based around permission more than it is based around necessarily restriction. So, you know, Cuba has all these things that people are allowed to do, all these different, you know, you're allowed to do baseball, you're allowed to play basketball and soccer, but there's definitely a suspicion in Cuba. And if you're doing something that's unrecognized or something that's new or something that feels countercultural, if you don't have permission to do them, you're not explicitly not allowed to do it, but on any given day, you might not be allowed to do it. And so it's kind of like a hard thing to explain. For our society, we're pretty much allowed to do anything until someone tells you not to. And there, it's just hard to imagine something so simple and innocent and healthy as surfing. On any given day, you can be arrested and have this surfboard that you've poured so much energy and love and care into creating, have that taken away just on the whim of someone else's decision. And so it's kind of that like general fear and discomfort of getting in the water that I think is really significant and really unique to Cuba.
Does it have something to do with the fear of having people escaping?
Right. Yeah. So the whole reason why, sorry, I didn't really dive into that. The why is basically based around our conflict with Cuba. If you're not familiar with the history of the tensions between the United States and Cuba, it's this long-standing Cold War embargo. And through several different periods in history, there have been mass migrations from Cuba to the United States. First big one was the Mariel boat lift in the 80s. And then the early 90s, with the fall of the Soviet Union, Cuba went into this tremendous economic crisis. And in that crisis, people made rafts out of whatever they could find, you know, car tires, any piece of foam that they could strap to a piece of wood, anything that would float, they would use to make these rafts to make their way to the United States. It was an incredibly dangerous journey, and people were leaving in really, really large numbers. So thousands of Cubans never made it to the United States. It created this really big political kind of tug of war between the US and Cuba, where Castro was willing to let people flee. The United States was feeling all this pressure of all the migrants coming in. You know, all the people in between were kind of used as this like chess piece. But eventually Castro shut down the border and wasn't allowing anybody to go into the water for anything. And that was pretty much the same time that surfing really started to develop in Cuba. So you can imagine that in that environment, getting on a surfboard in a country where people don't know anything about surfing, that it even exists as an activity, they're looking at all these surfers and thinking, oh, these guys are just trying to flee to the US.
Right. But then things changed also, where surfing was declared an Olympic sport.
Right.
And so we need to participate.
Totally. Cuba's an incredibly proud country, incredibly nationalistic, and also known historically as being fierce competitors. And of course, there are a lot of sports in the world, but the big stamp of legitimacy is the Olympics, and especially the ability to represent your country and have your country collect gold medals and accolades and really show what your people are made of. So for surfing to be included in the Olympics was tremendous for the ability for the Cuban surfers to validate their sport with their government. And, you know, unfortunately, there's a huge need for those two things to be fused.
Yeah, but it wasn't an easy sell.
No, and in fact, it still isn't. Just a few days ago, all the surfers were pulled from the water by the police. Wow. Even after the conclusion of our film, where they have gotten some form of recognition for surfing, it's still not enough. And a bunch of the surfers were pulled out and detained and had boards taken. So the fight is still, you know, who knows where it is really.
Yeah. How big a crew did you have?
Our crew was very small. It was basically myself, our DP and producer, Seth Brown, our water photographer and cinematographer, Marco Bava, and then our producer, Tyler Dunham. And so the four of us pretty much did everything: sound, shooting, direction, the whole gambit. And our team's expanded a bit since, as we've gotten closer to completing the film. But for all the principal photography, that was pretty much our group. And then some collaboration with some Cubans as well.
And what was it like getting access? I mean, were you welcomed, or was it challenge?
Access was pretty challenging. Not just the ability to like reach our characters. That was certainly challenging. And also obviously without internet communication, once we're not there, was extremely challenging to begin with. But the biggest challenge, I think, was sort of suspicion and trust, and our characters getting comfortable with us as people and being okay sharing certain details with us, knowing that we weren't just going to sensationalize it, that we were going to do our best to represent what the actual story was. And, you know, there's a lot of stuff that we left out that, you know, probably would have been better for us as filmmakers, but not necessarily as good for them as the subjects of the film. And so a lot of that trust was necessary. They needed to know that we weren't going to just exploit them like other people have done in the past. And right. For us, it just took a long time establishing that line of trust between us all.
Were there legal implications involved in that?
I'm not certain. I wouldn't call them legal implications.
But I mean, were some of your subject worried that what they were saying on film might end up haunting them?
Yes, definitely. And yeah, and it's one of those things that it's really hard to understand unless you are deeply ingrained in their culture, because certain things to us didn't sound that risky. But then when they've completely explained the context of what we were trying to share, what we were talking about, you know, we had all these aha moments where we're like, oh, wow. You get comfortable in a place, but there are certain moments where you're reminded that you are somewhere very different. And so there were certain lines, certain representations, certain portrayals of things that we had to be really cautious about. And they were really brave to share with us a lot of the things that they did and trust us with that information.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like the original film that you were making would be fantastic. I'd love to see that too, about the making of the surfboards and how resourceful they were. I hope maybe you have a sequel.
Yeah, we actually have a lot of footage that it's hard to fit everything into one film. We thought about doing a series. I think we'll probably do a lot of auxiliary content that maybe lives on social media and just share as much as we can to build that whole world. So that's a really important thing for us. Is there are all these portrayals of Cuba, and what we spent a long time there, And what we sort of grew to understand about the country is a much different world than is often delivered by crews that have been there for, you know, a week or 2 weeks filming, and by no fault of their own. It's just there is a facade in Cuba that is really hard to get past, and it just takes time. And so for us, building the authentic world was really important.
Right. So what's Frank and Yaya doing right now? You're still in contact, I'm sure.
Yeah, they're surfing a lot. Cuba's having a really difficult time with the pandemic. There are tremendous food shortages. So a lot of this stuff is really taking a backseat to just basic survival. Been speaking with them about how they're spending 24 hours in a food line just trying to get the bare rations to feed their families. So that, yeah, right now is the priority. But we do have some really cool stuff coming up as far as trying to figure out ways to combine efforts to grow surfing in Cuba.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
And have they gotten to see the film?
Yeah.
What did they think?
Yeah, it was really funny. They were struggling to try and get enough internet time to watch it, but they saw it and really liked it, which for us I think is the biggest stamp of approval. Because we made a couple of versions of the film. We brought one down, we sent them a couple, and the one that we brought down, they looked at it and they're like, "This is really bad." Like, no sugarcoating. They were like, this isn't very good. And we're like, yeah, but what about these ideas? They're like, I think you should go back to the drawing board.
Yeah.
But the final film that we shared, they were really, really happy with how the surfing community came across and everything that the film kind of delivered and brought to light.
Is there a chance it'll be able to be screened in Cuba? Or
yeah, definitely.
Good.
I think a lot will depend on sort of the political climate and how things progress, but we plan on going back down there and doing a screening there with them. We've already been talking with people about it, which will be really exciting.
I was wondering about is, making documentaries is always challenging, especially one as adventurous as this. And how were you able to fund your film?
Oh man, that was very difficult, to be honest. Our very first time that we went down, we knew that we wanted to go for a long time, partially because we'd heard kind of rumblings about some of these things. Like, we'd heard this Rolling Stones concert might happen. We'd heard that the country opened up and all these different crews were going down, and so we knew that it was going to be a really transformational moment. And so we were like, okay, well, let's just go and be a part of it and spend time there. So we took some jobs doing just short form content for other media outlets. And we just turned all that money around to fund our time filming the project with the surfers that we wanted to make. And we pretty much came out of our first trip like net neutral, maybe a little bit negative. But we also didn't entirely know what story we were going to tell at that time. And especially when we got back from that, we were like, that wasn't exactly what we'd imagined. And the fact that we grew the story together with the Cuban surfers, we didn't have an ending. We didn't know where it was going to go. We just kind of followed it. And without having all of those things in place, we struggled to get money. And so we just funded it ourselves through our company and had a really tough couple of years. But we just knew we wanted to keep going with it. And so
perseverance.
Yeah.
Yes. And do you have a distributor now?
Not yet. No, we're still looking, still shopping it around. And so hopefully we'll be somewhere soon.
Yeah. So as of now, how will people be able to see this film? Some of our people saw at the festival and are highly recommended. How would they be able to see it?
Yeah. Right now, the only way to view it will be by tuning into festivals. We're keeping it really close right now until we really know what we want to do with it and how to get it out. We're aiming to have the film completely polished and ready to go by International Surf Day in the summer.
Oh,
So aiming for that window somewhere between like mid-June and August. But until then, it'll just be through festivals and people that are willing to support it.
yeah. Any plans of maybe self-distributing it?
Yeah,
DVD?
self-distributing is definitely on the table. Where we're kind of, after we finished the film, I think we were ready to just take like a big breath and take a little bit of time to kind of decompress from the whole process. So we haven't been like pounding the pavement and fighting tooth and nail to get everything set up. Right now we're like, okay, let's just relax, let's enjoy the fruits of our labor, and let's see what comes of it. So we're just open to opportunities right now. And you know, we understand it's kind of an interesting film. It's a bit different than I think a lot of people necessarily know what to do with. It's surfing, it's, you know, a human story, it's foreign language, but at the same time, it also draws together all these parallels to a lot of human rights issues happening here in the United States. And it's also a lot of generational issues that they're going through, these kind of misunderstandings between generations. And it's also very wrapped up in foreign policy. And so we don't know, we're just hoping that the right people will see in it what we see in it and help us bring it to as many people as possible.
Yeah. And as I mentioned in the introduction, this is included in the DocLands educational program. So it means that high school students all around the country are going to be looking at this too.
Oh, I love that.
It's a very inspiring film, and hopefully you'll have some sort of educational access to it, and maybe you know, some way to get it out to kids.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important. You see kids these days really care a lot less about borders than generations in the past. And I think the most important thing for us is showing that these young people in Cuba are really not that much different than young people everywhere. They have similar hopes and dreams and interests and style. And, you know, it's not that different a place. And something that kept us coming back to Cuba was the mystery around it. It's a place that's so close, but is really so little is known about it. It's especially the authentic Cuba. There's people only know it for these kind of token items. And so for us, finding these people was incredibly fascinating, and to be able to represent them and try and connect like-minded people wherever they are on this subject is really important to us.
Yeah, and a lot of things people ask me after programming a film like this is there any way you can reach out and help the cause?
Yeah. Right now, we're still kind of formulating that plan because Cuba is a very challenging place to interact with. You know, we released a book about Cuba as well, with the intention of trying to help Cuba through it. And our project got pulled from Kickstarter because it said the word Cuba. You know, there are certain like limitations about how much you're even allowed to help them and what channels you're allowed to go through to help them. So we're still ironing all that stuff out, but we do have a plan developing. So yeah, that's where we're at. And the very final version of the film will have the call to action ironed out, because that is a big goal, is how do we meaningfully provide support at the end of all of this that pushes Cuban surfing forward. We're getting there.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Corey, for making this wonderful film. Do you have any new projects in the works outside of this?
Yes, sort of. I mean, in a different vein, we've done a lot of short form content. We actually just shot a narrative short film about, it's kind of like a fantasy about climate change. And we're developing some other documentary-based projects that run along similar. I mean, similar in some forms, but I don't think anything is going to be that similar to what we just made. But yeah, we are working on stuff. So
Great to hear.
We'll see.
Well, you're always welcome here at DocLands Film Festival. Looking forward to what's coming up.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it's amazing to be a part of it, and we really are thankful that you guys included us.
Thanks, Corey.